The city was in ruins. Towers that once stood tall, symbols of power and civilization, were now nothing but shattered remains, their steel skeletons barely holding together. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating, carrying the scent of death. Fires raged in the distance, crackling hungrily as they consumed whatever remained of the once great metropolis. The sky, once clear and filled with the lights of the city, was now darkened by the wreckage of fallen warships, their broken pieces floating like ghosts above the battlefield. Through the chaos, the Zyran shock troopers moved like predators, their black armor gleaming under the fiery glow of destruction. They were ruthless, executing any survivors they found. Their orders were clear: no mercy, no prisoners. The war was over. The enemy had lost. Now it was time to erase them completely. Hiding beneath a collapsed structure, Celia struggled to stay conscious. Blood dripped from the deep wound on her side, staining her once pristine combat suit. Pain throbbed through her body with every breath. She had been betrayed by her own squad, left to die when she refused to carry out the brutal execution orders. She had watched in horror as her fellow rebels, those who had once fought beside her, were gunned down one by one. And now she was alone. Through the cracks in the rubble, she saw them. Zyran soldiers systematically hunting down the last survivors. One of them, a towering brute with red markings on his armor, scanned the area with cold, calculating eyes. His rifle hummed softly, primed and ready to fire. She held her breath as he turned toward her hiding spot. Her heart pounded. Had he seen her? The Zyran took a step closer, then another. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at her position. And then, boom! A massive explosion erupted just meters away, sending debris and fire into the air. The Zyran soldier was thrown off balance, crashing against a broken pillar. More explosions followed, shaking the ground, lighting up the night like fireworks of destruction. Out of the smoke, a figure emerged. He moved like a ghost, his body cloaked in shimmering light, bending reality around him. In one swift motion, he raised his rifle, not Zyran tech, something sleeker, deadlier, and fired. A precise, controlled burst of plasma rounds ripped through the Zyran's armor. The enemy barely had time to react before he collapsed, lifeless. Celia could only stare. A human. He moved quickly, eliminating the remaining Zyran soldiers with brutal efficiency. His rifle hummed with intelligence, adjusting its aim in real time, anticipating movements before the enemy even made them. A tactical genius. A predator. For a moment, Celia forgot her pain. She had heard stories about humans, how they were nothing but weak, primitive creatures, barely worthy of being noticed by the great galactic empires. And yet, here he was. Fast, efficient, unpredictable. His visor glowed red as he scanned the area, ensuring no threats remained. Then, to her shock, he turned to her. Instead of aiming his weapon, he crouched down beside her. "You're still alive," he muttered, his voice distorted slightly through his helmet. Not the voice of a conqueror. The voice of a soldier. Celia tried to move, but pain surged through her body. She groaned, her vision blurring. Why was he helping her? What was a human even doing here? His gloved hand reached for a device on his belt, and before she could protest, a small drone hovered over her, scanning her wounds. The human soldier pulled out a med pack, injecting something into her arm. Immediately, the pain dulled, her body stabilizing. "Why? Help me," she managed to whisper. The human soldier looked at her for a moment before replying. "Because we don't leave people behind." Before she could process his words, an alarm blared in the distance. The Zyran reinforcements were coming. The human glanced toward the incoming enemy forces, his visor flashing. "We need to move." He grabbed her, pulling her onto his back with ease. Celia was too weak to resist. He activated something on his wrist console, and suddenly they'd vanished. Or at least, that's what it looked like. His cloaking device activated, bending light around them. To any outside observer, they had disappeared. As he carried her through the ruins, Celia couldn't help but feel something strange. Hope. For the first time, in a long time, she wasn't alone. They wove through the battlefield, avoiding drones, scanning for survivors, dodging enemy patrols, and slipping past Zyran enforcers like ghosts. The human's movements were precise, calculated. He was not just a soldier, he was a survivor. They took shelter inside a destroyed resistance bunker, its walls riddled with plasma burns and shattered metal. He set her down carefully, checking his rifle. Celia's breathing was steady now. The human had saved her life. "Who are you?" she finally asked. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a scared but determined face, his short brown hair damp with sweat. "Lieutenant James Carter, Earth's 3rd Recon Division." Celia frowned. Earth? She had heard the name before, but it was never spoken with respect. The Zyran Empire had always dismissed humans as insignificant, a young species with no real power. And yet, this man had just wiped out an entire squad of elite Zyran troopers. "Why are you here?" she asked, still struggling to understand. James leaned against the wall, reloading his weapon. "Because your people made a mistake," he said simply. "They thought humans were weak. They thought they could wipe us out." He looked at her, his dark eyes unshaken. They were wrong. Before Celia could respond, a distant explosion shook the ground. James's visor lit up as he scanned the surroundings. Zyran forces were closing in. "This isn't over," he muttered, gripping his weapon. He turned to Celia. "Can you fight?" She hesitated, then pushed herself up, pain still lingering but now manageable. She grabbed a fallen Zyran rifle and checked its charge. "I can fight." James smirked. Good. The enemy was coming. The Zyran Empire thought they had won. But tonight, they would learn the truth. Humans never went down without a fight. James didn't hesitate. His movements were precise, efficient. Years of battlefield experience had trained him to act first, question later. He knelt beside Celia, his fingers moving quickly as he pulled out a nano-med kit from his tactical belt. The small device hummed to life, scanning her wounds and injecting microscopic nanobots into her system. These bots would work fast, repairing tissue, stopping the bleeding, and stabilizing her condition. Celia barely stirred, her breaths shallow, her body trembling from the pain. She had already accepted death. Her people had left her behind, betrayed her. Why should she believe that this strange human, an enemy, would be any different? Her lips moved, barely forming words. "Why? Help me." James didn't even look up as he continued his work. "Because we don't leave people behind." His voice was steady, firm, like this was a universal truth. As if it didn't matter that she was an alien, that their people had been at war. He spoke like this was simply what humans did. Celia's eyes fluttered, trying to focus on his face. Was it possible? Could it be true? Before she could process it, a sharp alarm blared in the distance. James's visor flashed red with an incoming warning. The Zyran forces were closing in. They had detected the explosion. More troops would be here soon, along with combat drones. James's grip tightened around his rifle. They needed to move. Now. He lifted Celia onto his back effortlessly, securing her in place with one arm, while his other hand hovered over his wrist console. A soft hum filled the air as his cloaking device activated. In an instant, they vanished. Or at least, that's what it looked like. To the outside world, they blended perfectly into the ruins, light bending around them, making them nearly invisible. James moved fast, his steps silent, weaving through the broken cityscape. The Zyran soldiers were methodical, sweeping the area, their rifles glowing with deadly energy. James knew better than to engage. One wrong move, one sound, and they'd be dead. Drones hovered above, their scanning beams sweeping across the battlefield, searching for any sign of survivors. James crouched low, pressing himself and Celia against the remains of a collapsed wall. One of the drones drifted closer, too close. James's mind raced. He couldn't shoot it, not without alerting the soldiers. And if it detected them, it was over. He took a risk. Slowly, carefully, he extended his free hand toward the drone, his wrist console flashing as he accessed his hacking module. A quick bypass of the Zyran security encryption. A dangerous move, one that could backfire instantly. The drone shuddered midair. Its red scanning light flickered, then turned blue. James had done it. With a few more keystrokes, he turned the drone against its own masters. The machine whirled in place, then suddenly shot forward, targeting the Zyran patrol. Before they could react, a blast of energy tore through them. The ambush was swift, brutal. The drone had become their executioner. James didn't stop to admire his work. He sprinted forward, still cloaked, slipping past the chaos. They needed cover, a safe place, somewhere to regroup. Then he saw it, a destroyed resistance bunker. It had been hit hard, its entrance barely standing, but its underground levels might still be intact. If they could get inside, they'd have a fighting chance. James pushed forward, dodging more patrols, carefully avoiding security checkpoints. Finally, they reached the bunker. James kicked open the half-buried hatch, carrying Celia inside. He descended down the ruined staircase, scanning the area for any threats. It was dark, the air thick with dust, and the scent of burnt metal. He placed Celia down gently on an old medical table, her breathing still ragged but improving. "We should be safe here for now," he murmured, his eyes scanning the bunker for supplies. Celia's eyes slowly opened, her gaze locked onto James. Her voice was weak, but there was something in it, a quiet strength. "You risked your life. For me." James sat down against the wall, checking his rifle. He shrugged. "That's what we do." Celia looked at him for a long moment, her mind racing. Her people had called humans weak, primitive, but this man had just saved her. And she wasn't sure why. But she was starting to believe everything she had been told about humans was a lie. The bunker was silent except for the faint hum of old machines struggling to stay active. Dim emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting eerie shadows across the cracked metal floor. James moved quickly, scanning the small room for supplies. They needed weapons, medical gear, anything that could keep them alive. Celia lay on the cold table, her breathing steadier now, though her body was still weak. The nanobots had stopped the bleeding, but her energy was drained. She turned her head slightly, watching as James worked with practiced efficiency. "You're not like the others," she murmured, her voice hoarse. James glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Others?" Celia hesitated, then sighed. "Humans. We were taught that you're reckless, fragile, no match for the Zyran Empire." James smirked, his fingers tightening around a makeshift bandage as he wrapped it around her arm. "Yeah. And what do you think now?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, with a weak chuckle, she whispered, "I think they were wrong." James's expression softened. He finished securing the bandage and sat back against the cold metal wall, stretching out his legs. "We've been underestimated for a long time. Aliens look at us and see a species that shouldn't have made it this far. But we don't fight like they do. We fight smarter, not harder." Celia turned her head fully now, staring at him. "Smarter and kinder." James shrugged. "That part depends on who you meet." Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. After a while, Celia spoke again. "I wasn't strong enough for my people," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Zyran value power above all else. They see kindness as a weakness. I refuse to execute prisoners. I believe mercy had its place in war. But my own squad, they turned on me, left me to die." James listened, his expression unreadable. "Guess that makes two of us," he finally said. Celia frowned. "What do you mean?" James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "My unit was ambushed. Most of my team didn't make it. Command thought we were all dead. I was left behind, just like you." She studied him, seeing something in his eyes, something familiar. "You kept fighting," she murmured. James nodded. "Because that's what we do." For the first time since she had been abandoned, Celia didn't feel alone. But the moment was short-lived. A sharp beeping sound shattered the silence. James's visor flashed red. A proximity alert. Celia's body tensed. "What is it?" James checked his wrist console, his jaw tightening. "They found us." A warning siren blared throughout the bunker as red emergency lights pulsed along the walls. A security monitor flickered to life, showing a grainy image of Zyran soldiers advancing toward their location. Celia forced herself to sit up, groaning in pain. How? James's mind worked fast. The cloaking device had hidden them from sight, but heat signatures were another story. "The nanobots in your system," he realized. "They're repairing your body, generating heat. The Zyran must have picked up the thermal signature." Celia cursed under her breath. "Can you fight?" James's visor calculated the number of hostiles closing in. 10 heavily armed Zyran shock troopers. He checked his rifle. Only 3 plasma charges left. "Fight," James muttered, a smirk playing at his lips. "Not exactly." Celia looked at him, confused. "Then what?" James locked eyes with her. "We improvise." James worked fast, his fingers moving with precision as he rigged the bunker into a death trap. Every wire, every explosive charge, every piece of tech had to be perfect. If they wanted to survive the incoming Zyran assault, they needed every advantage possible. Celia, still weak but regaining strength, watched him with growing curiosity. The Zyran Empire relied on overwhelming force and superior technology. But this human, he was unpredictable. "You're planning something," she muttered, shifting her weight as she pushed herself up. James smirked, setting up another trap. "That's what we humans do. We make do with what we have." The bunker was small, too small to hold off an army. But James had turned battlefields into graves with far less. He placed plasma charges along the entrances, rigged motion sensors to detonate explosives, and stacked debris in ways that would create deadly bottlenecks. Celia winced as she tried to stand. Her wounds were healing, but her body was still weak. "I can fight." James glanced at her. "You sure?" She nodded. "I won't be a liability." Before James could respond, the ground trembled. They both turned toward the bunker's entrance. The sound of Zyran boots marching in unison echoed through the ruins above them. Then came the metallic clanking of drones hovering in formation. The Zyran had arrived. James exhaled slowly. Showtime. A loud explosion rocked the bunker entrance as the first Zyran soldier tripped a proximity mine. Fire and shrapnel burst outward, sending bodies flying. The enemy didn't hesitate. More stormed in, their energy rifles glowing with charged plasma rounds. James moved like a phantom. He weaved between the debris, using the shadows to his advantage. The first soldier who stepped too close never saw the attack coming. James grabbed him, twisted his rifle upward, and fired a plasma shot straight into his own faceplate. Celia gasped as James used the soldier's collapsing body as cover, then whipped around and fired 3 precise shots. The plasma bolts hit their marks, dropping 2 more Zyran instantly. The bunker erupted into chaos. Celia grabbed a fallen rifle. She had never fought like this before, never with such desperation, such reckless intensity. But the human had shown her something. He had saved her. And now, she would fight beside him. A Zyran charged at her, energy blade humming to life. Celia sidestepped, raising her rifle, but she wasn't fast enough. James was. He grabbed the Zyran's arm, twisting it with inhuman speed, and drove his knife deep into the alien's exposed neck joint. Celia stared in shock as James turned to her. "You okay?" She blinked, gripping her rifle tighter. "I will be." More Zyran poured in, their heavy armor making them look unstoppable. James grabbed a plasma grenade, tossed it into a cluster of enemies, and dived behind cover just as the explosion ripped through the bunker. But the Zyren weren't slowing down. James cursed. They were running out of time. A drone locked onto him, its targeting system flashing red. Before it could fire, James activated his EMP pulse. A wave of blue energy pulsed outward. The drone's lights flickered and died. Zyren weapons malfunctioned. Shields dropped. But James felt his own systems short out. His cloaking device was fried. His visor flickered, struggling to reboot. Damn it. Celia saw what happened. Without his tech, he was vulnerable. Azurin took advantage of the moment, charging at James with a plasma blade raised high. Celia didn't think. She moved. She raised her rifle, aimed, and fired. The Zyren fell before he could strike. James turned to her, surprised. "You fight smarter, not harder," Celia said, breathing heavily. "I learned from the best." The bunker trembled violently. The ceiling began to crack. The battle was tearing the structure apart. James grabbed Celia's arm, pulling her toward the exit. "We have to move." Just as they reached the tunnel entrance, the bunker began to collapse. A massive chunk of metal fell between them and the remaining Zyren. They were trapped inside. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from deep within the ruins above them, a low, distant rumbling filled the air. Celia's eyes widened. James tightened his grip on his rifle. Something big was coming. The ground trembled beneath them. A deep, distant roar filled the air, like the sky itself was tearing apart. Dust and rubble cascaded from the collapsed bunker's ceiling as Celia and James steadied themselves. Celia's sharp hearing picked up a strange hum, one she had never encountered before. It wasn't the harsh, mechanical drone of Zyren warships. It was something different, something powerful. James exhaled, a slow grin forming despite the pain lacing his body. "That's our ride." Before Celia could ask what he meant, the entire battlefield outside was consumed in fire. A brilliant blue beam shot from the heavens, slicing through the Zyren front lines like a blade through paper. The very air crackled as massive explosions followed, engulfing Zyren war machines in devastating shockwaves. Then she saw it, a behemoth of metal and power descending through the clouds. A massive human warship, unlike anything she had ever seen, broke through the smoky atmosphere. Its colossal cannons roared, bombarding enemy forces with relentless firepower. Every shot was precise, every strike calculated. Celia stood frozen, eyes wide. This wasn't just war. This was annihilation. The Zyren had always spoken of humans as an inferior race, weak, unworthy of true conquest. And yet, here they were, tearing through Zyren forces like they were nothing. James collapsed against a fallen metal beam, clutching his side. He was hurt, badly. Celia rushed to him. "Stay with me." James chuckled, wincing, not planning on dying just yet. The ground shuddered again as drop pods screamed down from orbit, slamming into the earth like meteor strikes. The heavy doors hissed open, and human Marines poured out, their rifles blazing. The Zyren, caught between the orbital assault and the advancing human soldiers, fell into chaos. They were being slaughtered. A Zyren commander, his dark armor gleaming under the burning sky, barked orders into his communicator. His forces were failing. He knew it. Without hesitation, he turned and ran. Celia's heart pounded. She had been abandoned, left to die, betrayed by her own people. James had saved her, and now she had a choice. She picked up her rifle. She wouldn't run. The Zyren commander sprinted through the wreckage, leaping over burning debris, dodging bodies of his fallen soldiers. His escape ship was close. He could still make it. But then, a single plasma shot tore through his leg. He collapsed, snarling in pain. Slow, measured footsteps approached him. Celia stepped into view, rifle raised. The Zyren commander looked up, rage flickering in his eyes. "You're a traitor," he spat. "You side with these." These humans. Celia's grip tightened. The Zyran had abandoned her, left her for dead. James had saved her. She pulled the trigger. A single, final shot ended him. The battlefield was still ablaze, but the Zyran forces had been broken. The warship above shifted position, ceasing its bombardment. The battle was won. Celia turned back, watching as human soldiers lifted James onto a medical transport. He looked at her, offering a weak but genuine smile. "You coming?" he asked. Celia hesitated. Her own people had betrayed her. But the humans, they had fought for her. They had saved her. She took a deep breath. Then she stepped forward. "Of course I stayed," she whispered, her fingers brushing his hand. "I couldn't leave you, not after everything you did for me." For a moment, there was only silence. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but determined. "I want to help end this war, Ryan. I know things that could change everything, but I can't do it alone." "You won't have to," he said without hesitation. Her eyes met his, and something passed between them, a quiet promise, a shared understanding. In the midst of war, they had found something worth fighting for, and neither of them was ready to let it go. The days after the battle passed in a blur of pain and recovery. Ryan Voss lay in a sterile medical bay, his body patched up but still aching with every movement. The war had taken its toll on him, not just physically, but in ways he couldn't quite describe. Yet through it all, one thing remained constant: Kalara. She was always there. When he woke from fevered nightmares, she was the one who calmed him. When the pain became too much, her soft voice soothed him. She stayed by his side when others would have walked away. And as the days turned into weeks, Ryan found himself relying on her presence more than he realized. Kalara had changed too. In the safety of the human colony, far from the front lines, she began to heal, not just her body, but her spirit. The fear that had once filled her eyes was replaced by determination. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was someone with a purpose. She spent hours with human scientists and strategists, sharing what she knew of her people's technology and the inner workings of the Zilari Dominion. Her knowledge was invaluable, and it quickly became clear that without her help, humanity would have never stood a chance. But it wasn't just her brilliance that captured Ryan's attention. It was her heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the colony's horizon, they sat together outside the medical bay. The sky burned with shades of orange and violet, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Kalara's eyes reflected the colors, glowing softly in the fading light. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. Ryan didn't answer right away. He watched the sky, the memories of that night flashing through his mind. The fear, the fire, the way she had looked up at him, broken and terrified, and still so very alive. "Because you didn't deserve to die," he said finally. "Because I saw someone who needed help, and I couldn't turn my back on that." She smiled then, a small, fragile thing. "My own people wouldn't have done the same. That's their loss," he said, his voice gentle. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, something that had been growing since the moment he'd carried her out of the flames. It was more than trust, more than gratitude. It was something deeper, something neither of them dared to name just yet. The war raged on, but the colony remained a sanctuary, a place where hope began to take root. And as Ryan regained his strength, he and Kalara grew closer. They trained together, fought side by side in simulations, and shared quiet moments when the weight of the conflict became too much. One night, as they sat around a small fire, Kalara spoke of her past. She told him about her life as a scientist, how she had fought against her people's hunger for conquest, and how that defiance had led to her being abandoned on the battlefield. "I never believed in this war," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But they didn't care. They saw me as weak, a traitor. If you hadn't found me, you're stronger than they ever gave you credit for," Ryan interrupted softly. "And you're not alone anymore." She looked at him then, And in that moment, the walls between them crumbled completely. He reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and the firelight danced across their skin. As the days turned into weeks, that bond only grew stronger. What had started as trust became friendship, and then something more. One evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the colony, Kalara turned to him, her eyes filled with a rare vulnerability. "I never thought I'd find a home here," she said quietly. "But with you, I feel safe. I feel happy." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He reached up, brushing a strand of her shimmering hair behind her ear. "You are home," he whispered. "With me." Their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss, and in that single touch, the world around them faded away. The war, the fear, the pain, none of it mattered. In that moment, all that existed was them. When the news finally came that the war was ending, it was Kalara who stood beside humanity, advocating for peace. Her voice carried weight, and her bravery inspired others, even those who had once called her an enemy. And when the fighting finally stopped, when the weapons were laid down and the treaties were signed, Ryan knew there was only one thing left he wanted. As they stood together in the aftermath of it all, he took her hands in his and looked into those glowing blue eyes he had come to love so deeply. "Stay with me," he said softly. "Not because of the war, not because of what we've been through. Stay because I love you, and I don't want to face this life without you." Tears welled in her eyes, and her answer came in a single breathless word: yes. In the ruins of war, they had found something beautiful, and together they would build a future worth fighting for. Their wedding was not just a simple ceremony. It was a moment that would be remembered by both humans and Zilari alike, a symbol of unity in a world that had known nothing but war for so long. Ryan and Kalara stood before their people, hand in hand, their eyes filled with love and hope. They were no longer just an unlikely pair of survivors. They were the living proof that even in the darkest of times, something beautiful could emerge. The venue was an open area surrounded by lush greenery, a stark contrast to the barren, war-torn land they had once known. The ruins of the battlefield had given way to something new, something that breathed life instead of death. It was a hopeful beginning, not only for them, but for all those who had fought so hard for peace. Kalara stood in a flowing gown, her violet skin shimmering in the sunlight. It was a simple dress, made from the finest materials the human colony could provide. But to Ryan, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She was radiant, not just in her appearance, but in the way she had transformed from a soldier to a beacon of hope. Ryan wore a military uniform, now modified for the occasion. His armor had been discarded in favor of something less practical but far more meaningful. His eyes, however, still carried the weight of the war, the pain of everything they had lost, and the quiet promise to never forget. The ceremony itself was brief, but it didn't need to be long to carry immense weight. The officiator, a human representative of the Peace Council, spoke of love, sacrifice, and the possibility of a future free from the shadows of war. But it was the vows, spoken softly by Ryan and Kalara, that made the moment truly unforgettable. Ryan's voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Kalara, when I found you, you were broken, and so was I. But together, we've rebuilt not only ourselves but the world around us. I promise to stand by you, not just in peace, but in every challenge we face. I'll protect you, love you, and honor you, always." Kalara's voice trembled, but she spoke with conviction. "Ryan, you saved me when I had nothing left. You showed me what love is, and you gave me a future I never thought possible. I promise to stand by your side, to fight for you and for our people. I'll never let go, no matter what comes." When they exchanged rings, simple, handmade bands, the crowd erupted in applause. But it wasn't just the humans who cheered. The Zilari, who had once seen Ryan as an enemy, stood in silence, their faces filled with a mixture of respect and awe. Many of them had come to understand that Kaelura's love for Ryan was not a betrayal, but a sign of hope for their future. But even in the midst of celebration, Ryan and Kaelura knew the peace they had fought so hard for was fragile. There were still factions within the Zilari Dominion who viewed their love as a threat. Those who believed that peace was an illusion and that humanity's rise was a challenge to their power. That night, as the stars twinkled overhead, Ryan and Kaelura sat together on a balcony overlooking the colony. The laughter from the wedding reception faded into the background as they shared a quiet moment. "Do you think they'll ever accept us?" Kaelura asked softly, her head resting on Ryan's shoulder. Ryan didn't hesitate. "We've already proven them wrong, haven't we? We survived the worst, Kaelura. We fought when everyone told us we couldn't, and we're still here. And as long as we're together, we'll keep fighting, not just for us, but for everyone who believes in a better world." She nodded, her eyes glimmering with determination. "I'm not afraid of what comes next, Ryan. Not when I have you." Ryan kissed the top of her head, his heart swelling with love. "And I'll never let you go. We'll face whatever comes, side by side." The following days were filled with both celebration and tension. There were moments of laughter, of quiet conversations with friends who had become family, but there were also hushed discussions in private rooms, warnings from diplomats, and threats from those who didn't believe in the new world they were trying to build. Ryan and Kaelura knew that their journey wasn't over. They had fought for survival, for peace, and now they would fight for the future they had promised to each other. The first sign of trouble came sooner than they had expected. A group of Zilari extremists, still loyal to the war-hungry leaders of the Dominion, began to stir unrest in the outer colonies. They believed that by disrupting the fragile peace, they could force the Zilari people back into war. Their message was clear. The alliance with humanity was a betrayal, and Kaelura's marriage to Ryan was an insult to their honor. Ryan and Kaelura knew this was coming. They had hoped for peace, but they were prepared for the fight that still loomed. They spent hours in discussions, strategizing with military leaders and diplomats, trying to figure out how to combat the growing threat without plunging their worlds back into war. The first skirmishes were small, a few attacks on human convoys and a few scattered raids in the outer colonies. But it didn't take long for the situation to escalate. Ryan, now fully recovered from his injuries, was once again called to the front lines. He and Kaelura stood together, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. But this time, they were not alone. The peace they had fought for was not just a dream of two people, it was a dream shared by many. And as they stood at the forefront of that struggle, they were surrounded by allies, humans and Zilari who had come to believe in the vision of a united future. One evening, as they prepared for another battle, Kaelura turned to Ryan with a look of determination. "We'll make it through this. We have to." Ryan kissed her forehead, his eyes filled with a promise. "We will. We've come this far, Kaelura, and we're not going back." The battle that followed was fierce, but it wasn't just about weapons and tactics. It was about the future of both their peoples. Every victory, every small triumph, brought them one step closer to the peace they had dreamed of. When the final battle was won, and the last of the extremist forces had been defeated, Ryan and Kaelura stood on the battlefield, not as conquerors, but as symbols of the hope that had led them through the darkest of times. As they looked toward the stars, hand in hand, they knew that their story was far from over. They had won this fight, but there would always be challenges ahead. Together, they would face them, as partners, as warriors, and as a symbol of what love could achieve. And so, as the dawn of a new era broke, Ryan and Kaelura stood ready. Their love had carried them through the worst of times, and it would carry them through whatever lay ahead. Together, they had built a future worth fighting for, and they would protect it, no matter the cost. Their story was only just beginning.